to know.
Yeah.
Okay, and all right, so we thought we'll start the bookworm session with a short introduction into the QCA book bibliography. To do so, I basically brought my own QCA library, and this is a question that often comes up in courses. What kind of QCA books are there? And you often reference QCA books. So this is a very personal My QCA library. They're from my office, the books here. I'll quickly run through them, and I hope this gives you a bit of a background into the new books that are coming up. So there's the all-time favorite, and I hope you see everything. Otherwise, Sophia will post the references also in the chat, or you can write to one of us. We all know the books, I guess, by heart, most of them. So here's 1987. The Comparative Method. That's the first book that Charles Reagan wrote about QCA. Charles is an excellent writer. He's not online, so don't worry. It's just it's the truth. He writes excellently. If you want to read about the origins of QCA, the first idea is this is a great one. It's a must read. After the 1987 book, nothing happened for 23 years until Fuzzy Set Social Science came out, also by Charles in 2000. This is the shift from Chris Set QCA to Fuzzy Set QCA, so from ones and zeros to something between zeros and ones with a point of ambiguity. Don't yell at me, Adrian. Okay, Fuzzy Set, it's great. Equally well written, good book. Those are two must-haves, I think. Here's Configurational-Comparative Methods, came out in 2009, I think. Does someone know? It's 2009. It's a great summary of the two, and it goes a bit broader than QCA. So it tries to establish the link QCA to other comparative methods. Also a good read, and once you've read these three things, you start to realize they talk about similar things, so you get a bit of a hang of what QCA is about. The other three books that I have here are a bit outliers. Gary Gertz's Social Science Concept, I think, was a great read for me, a big opened the door to new ideas. He basically only talks about social science concepts. It's related to QCA, but I don't think QCA is explicitly, maybe in a few spots in there, but it's a lot about putting social science concepts together, the conceptual background, architecture, measuring them, returning to concepts, redefining, etc. Great book. Gary also has a couple of new books coming out. I think I can recommend all of them, even without having read them. This one I read. Now, the last two are a bit of outliers. Intersectional Inequality is a book by Charles Reagan and Per Fiss, published last year, 2 years, 3 years ago, something like this. It's a new 2017. Intersectional inequality does two things. It introduces this idea of set intersectionality, so it makes a methodological step forward, really focusing on the core analytics of QCA and developing them further. Is that okay, Adrian? I'm always looking at Adrian. He looks so mean with the mask on. And it makes a big contribution to a debate in the US about social inequality. So it's a double nice read if you want. And the sixth book I have here is only available in German. It's actually a doctoral thesis. Qualitative Comparative Analysis and Configurational Thinking in Management Studies. I don't think anyone in the room knows this book. Does anyone? 2, 3? This is
There's an English translation.
Yeah, there is an English translation. Sorry.
I have the English translation. Yeah.
Yes, I have an English version here, actually. Okay, so this book is probably the least appreciated QCA book, I think, of all. But it has at least one nice contribution. It's on page 62. You see it's bookmarked with a post-it. It's a heuristic of for working with for dealing with model ambiguity. This is a rule of thumb of how many conditions you can choose when it comes to how many cases you have. I said it's a heuristic. It's based on Conrad, I think, looked over 100 studies and just came up with some sort of funny formula that says that's probably the right number of conditions if this is your data set. It's underappreciated. There's a lot of other model studies out there with hypothetical data, etc. This, by my experience, is the best guide you can get to selecting the number of conditions when it comes to a QCA model. It's not perfect, it's a heuristic, but it always comes extremely close to the right number of conditions. You don't have to buy the book. I don't even know if you can probably buy it, but if someone's interested in this equation, I'm happy to send it over.
Which page?
62. Yes. Okay, now there's two books missing that are not here because one of the students that I'm supervising is currently using them. There's a book, Schneider and Wagemann, Set Theoretic Methods for Sciences, and I think everyone in the room knows this. Probably, my guess is 80% in the Zoom call know this. This is an absolute standard for libraries nowadays. If you really want to learn QCA, this is the hands-on textbook with everything that you need to know if you want to implement QCA. If the book were here, you would see that it's has notes all over the place. My version, it has comments. The students aren't treating it well, etc. It's a great book, absolute essential for a library. And if you do more than 2 QCA studies, just get a version. It's very helpful. And then there's Adrian's book on QCA with R that came out 2 years ago. Is that right, Adrian? 3 years ago. Yeah. I don't have it here because it's actually, there's a version online. Can I say, yeah, okay, I can say this. You can, if you want, you can post a link. Yeah. That's the other book that the student is using at the moment. It's a great book. She just told me yesterday, it's amazing how he writes. There's this mix of, I understand how to use the R package and I understand what QCA is. So I think that's the nice thing about Adrian's book, QCA with R. And this leaves me, 9:14, this leads me to the 2 new books that are coming up that we're presenting today. Actually,
how did you not mention redesigning social inquiry though?
I was wondering where it was. I thought it's probably somewhere else. Why did you say that here?
But that's an essential.
Just post it. And you could go out of the room. Okay. The 2 books that we're hearing about today from Patrick, Nena, Carsten, and Eva are 2 books that, to me, belong to a new, if you will, a new generation of QCA textbooks. And they probably started with Adrian's QCA with R, and you'll see both books deal with how to use R and how to run QCA with R. Patrick's book, and he will tell you more about it later. I don't know either of the books, but I ordered them. Patrick's book goes through the cycle of a research project, the entire cycle, research design cycle, and in this process also tells you how to use R and how to implement these different steps in R. Nena, Carsten, and Eva's book, from what I understand, is more an introduction to the method. It's an update of the textbook. It's also can be used for teaching, has a lot of illustrations. And in addition to the R package, they also explain a related package, the set methods package that they developed. And I'm not too familiar with the packages, so my apologies if I didn't get this completely right. It's 9:16, and that basically ends my personal library to my personal QCA book library. Are there any questions from the audience in the Zoom call? You can always get in touch with us if you have questions, if you need readings. We have all the references available. If there are no questions, then I would hand over to Patrick now. Are you in the room, Patrick?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great.
share my screen? Or maybe can you allow me to share my screen?
Yeah, you should be able to share it, but we have a question.
Okay. Well, you are sharing already. That's why.
Anna. So Anna asked if there are any empirical QCA studies that we would recommend. Yes, but I think this is very field specific. So if you're in sociology or political science, you probably want to look at different empirical studies than if you're in management business studies. I don't know what field you're in, but I think what I would recommend you to do is political science. Yeah, I recommend you write to Manuel, and Manuel will send you some of the excellent political science QCA studies. Yeah, it's a good question. Anyone out there using some of these well-published studies as templates to see how QCA papers are structured and written, how you write up the methods, the calibration part, etc. That's often very helpful if you're getting started with QCA. And Anna is looking forward to your email. I'm on it. All right.
Yeah.
Then I'll hand over to Patrick, and any questions you have in the meanwhile, just go ahead, post them on the chat or ask them directly.
Yeah.
We have enough time, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
All right. Can I share now? Or are you still sharing?
Now it should work.
Okay.
And Patrick has a lot more books in his library.
Yeah, I was about to mention some of them, but I didn't want to prolong this. Okay, so can you see my slides?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to talk about the recent book. I'm happy to do so. It shouldn't take longer than 20 minutes at most, probably less. But if I ramble on too long, please just interrupt me. So I'm very happy to talk about the book. It just came out, so it's actually there as a hard copy now. I'm very happy to have this. And I think in Europe it will come out in January. So I received an advance copy or so. I think in January it will be deliverable. What does the book try to do? I mean, we already heard about many excellent books. So why is there a need for another book? Maybe the question. It's published with Georgetown University Press, and the aim was to provide a comprehensive and up-to-date introduction to QCA in a single volume, realizing also that there's so many books and maybe hard for people who are entirely new to the method to start with this. I first read through all of Reagan's great books, which I also love, and I recommend every time I teach QCA. But as a starter, it might be good to have a single volume that provides a gentle introduction. The book also emphasizes something that I thought was a little bit on the sidelines of existing texts, and you really need to read many books to cover that, especially research design. So that's the emphasis that I place on turning a research project into a QCA study, how to present analytical findings, what these scores mean. I mean, we know about how to get certain measures of fit, but what do they mean? How do we deal with them? How do we interpret them? I try to illustrate the key concepts and the empirical application of QCA also with examples from across the social sciences. So my own area is political science and international relations, but I've asked colleagues across the social sciences, and I have a slide on that in a moment, to provide examples and teaching QCA to various people, linguists and people in medicine and political science and other areas. I've also realized that people have quite different understandings of what QCA is and how it can be employed, how it should be employed. I try to cover that in the book, this diversity, how QCA is used. The book has 10 chapters. It also has an online R manual as a basic starter on R. It doesn't aim to provide a full introduction. I think that's what Nena, Carsten, and Eva's book does, and they'll talk about it in a minute. So the first few chapters, 4 chapters in the book, try to lay the foundation of QCA, provide an introduction to the method itself, what the strengths are, why we should worry about it, why we should think about using it. Trends in QCA applications. I also try to provide a brief history, something that we just talked about, these books that exist and how the method evolved and debates that we had in the field. Second chapter is research design, as I try to emphasize this part, really talking about research questions, uses of QCA, whether to test hypotheses in the first place, how they're supposed to look like to test them with QCA. Considerations of case selection, an important part of QCA, that is a bit on the sideline in many discussions. And then also about ways to combine QCA with other methods. And I provide a survey of empirical applications to give you an idea, or readers an idea, how QCA is used and what kind of conditions, case ratios people use, etc. Chapter 3 is about set theory, the basics that we know about, crisp and fuzzy sets, operations, etc., and assessing set relations. Chapter 4 is an addition that I cared about a lot, and probably the most of the work went into the chapter 4, I think, dealing with the philosophical literature on causation. So at some point I realized I need to talk about this. This is one of the elephants in the room, and people worry about this, and people have written about it. We have a great special issue by Tim Hessebrook and Eva Thomann, where part of the discussion is really about different solution terms, causal analysis, the possibility of causal analysis, and different understandings of causation. So I dived into that and was lost for several months working on this and trying to summarize it in some way. And talk about the different theories of causation that we have in the social sciences and recent writings on that. And I try to bridge that with causal complexity and to draw this connection between these kind of separate literatures and separate discussions. And then also try to talk about causal analysis and then recent proposals and debates. As we know, there is no consensus on this, but there are different positions. And I also take a position on that and try to provide that to the readers to talk about this. The core of the book is then about calibrating sets, measures of fit, and set theoretic analysis. This is the core of the analysis itself, the method applied with the software and the well-known procedures. My emphasis here is also to provide illustrations as much as I can, to provide examples. How is consistency calculated? How is coverage calculated? What would it mean if the scores look a little different? And really simple examples where people can actually do the calculation themselves, also for the calibration, to not leave it as a black box. We put something inside and then we get these decimal scores, but to show how this happens and that there's no mystery to it, but really just calculations and the way your data is structured affects the kind of measures of fit that you will get. The set theoretic analysis puts these things together in one comprehensive chapter, talking about solution terms and illustrating them. Towards the end, I also have a section on counterfactual analysis and try to update this discussion of logical remainders, how they should be used and can be used in solution terms. The debate about different kinds of solution terms is touched here, and recommendations as how to proceed in your own applied QCA studies. The final part of the book is about QCA variants. So I also try to do justice to the different developments in QCA methodology, realizing that most people seem to use crisp set and fuzzy set QCA, but still, this is a dynamic area and people are working on multi-value QCA, temporal QCA, especially different proposals. Also yesterday, we saw one winning the prize on temporal QCA, two-step QCA, and so forth. I try to provide examples for all of these, so published examples of studies using these variants, also fuzzy set ideal type analysis, and then finally wrap up with a view at some related methods and approaches where I would say they're not proper QCA, but related, and I touch upon them briefly. Chapter 9 was another elephant in the room. The question, do you address the critics or not? And I think it's just right to do that, because for those of you who submitted maybe your first QCA paper, you may have gotten reviews and you may have people being very critical of the method and saying, yeah, but like we've seen this or that, and that's wrong, or this solution type is wrong or something like that. So I wanted to summarize the debate, what's out there. It's also a debate that starts in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then we have recent contributions. So it's quite a lot of material, and it's hard to get into that if you're starting with QCA anew. And it might frighten you to say, okay, maybe I don't touch this. My supervisor told me QCA has been criticized, as every method probably has. So I try to summarize that along the lines of discussions about analytical robustness, comparisons with other methods, formalization and algorithms, and a kind of internal debate about causal analysis and solution terms. So the last part is really about QCA proponents discussing amongst themselves about different ways to use the method and also related methods. I wrap this up with a discussion of the strengths and limitations of QCA. It's not a silver bullet method. I don't claim that, but QCA has strengths and we should use them and make the most of them. The final chapter then is about providing some guiding principles for QCA, documenting and communicating results, which is also very close to my heart, to not just do your QCA, but really do put in the effort and to also communicate the results. Right. And there's a glossary of terms, which I also thought was important. We have so many different terminology, so much terminology floating around, and this can also confuse new readers. So I wanted to have a comprehensive glossary in there that tries to summarize and provide definitions of key terms. These are the guest contributors across the social sciences. So people from political geography, sociology, political science, public policy, law, environmental studies, and international relations. Very different applications. Some are multi-method uses, some fuzzy set QCA, multi-value QCA, two-step QCA, MDSO, MSDO, crisp set QCA. So really across the board, very different applications. And I've asked the contributors to reflect upon their application and their experience also in the peer review process, briefly to talk about this and whatever they think might be useful to share with readers who might engage in similar projects. The survey of QCA studies I did across 6 fields. I looked at 120 QCA studies in recent years, starting in 2020 backward. So for most fields, this was the last 1 or 2 years. I think in sociology, it stretches a bit further back because we didn't have that many published studies on the Web of Science. And what's clear is that fuzzy set QCA is the dominant variant, at least for those fields that I looked at and the studies that I looked at. It was interesting to see that there's a bit of a uniformity even with regards to the conditions and cases. So the ratio across most fields, with the exception of business studies, is between 5 and 6 conditions or cases per condition. And I think that's a good sign. So people are not using too many conditions per case, and that's a good indicator. Business studies is a bit different. They just have many more cases as a median value of 180. And we see some publication trends at the bottom. My emphasis is on research design. I've mentioned this, and Johannes was so kind to mention this research cycle, which is at the core of the book. Starting with the research problem, definition of different research questions, how can a research question be formulated in order to be useful with QCA, in order to be answerable with QCA. And I distinguish by focus, condition-centered and outcome-centered questions, and case-specific and general questions. And this gives us a 2x2 table where we can have different kinds of research questions aiming for different things. The 4 uses of QCA I have at the bottom, different case selection approaches from using populations, given populations or scope conditions up down to certain ways of sampling, which need to be used with caution. The chapter on causation and QCA and its critics, some illustrations from those, and a summary of the strengths and limitations. As I mentioned, there are key strengths and we need to make the most of them. And there are also some limitations which can be addressed. So there have been very good proposals on this, which I refer to in this chapter. And I think if people pay attention to that, then most of the limitations of QCA can really be fruitfully addressed. If you're interested in the book and more information, you can go to the Georgetown University website. They have some information there, also some reviews of the book or endorsements. And on my website, I have some online material, which is linked there, which will also be linked to some kind of external repository at some point. And please feel free to just drop me a mail if you have a question about the book. Happy to answer any questions. Hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick. No, you were perfectly on time with your presentation. Let's see if there are some questions or comments about your presentation and your book from the audience. We have a lot of claps. So.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Yes.
Patrick, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Just curious to know whether you're taking a particular approach to causality, because you mentioned that there are different, you have chapter 4, you spent a lot of time writing it. Do you take a particular stance, and what stance do you take? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, this may start a longer debate. So I realize that the regularity approach has seen quite some popularity and has been embraced by many people. I'm a bit skeptical about this. So I think, I mean, if we go back to proposals about regularity theory, some of that doesn't seem to square with my understanding of QCA. So in that light, I kind of tend a bit more toward a critical realist perspective. But I also notice there are some inconsistencies. I think that's also why it's an area of further development. I'm generally, for applied QCA, I'd be very careful to claim causation in the first place. And I'd rather recommend not making too bold claims based on observational data if people apply it themselves. And I've seen, unfortunately, some applications where people have been very straightforward in saying, I do a causal analysis and I've identified causal factors, where I would say, no, I mean, it's not the case. You're not just there yet. So, but I think it's generally, it's nice that the field is moving in that direction and we are having these debates, and also that we're having different proposals, as you can see in the special issue, also edited by Tim and Eva, with different ideas. So, I mean, the contributors clearly don't agree on that. And I think that's also a good sign.
Yeah, thank you. Then Ryan has a question.
Hi, yes. I'm just wondering what the sort of target audience is for this book, and what sort of level of prerequisite knowledge would a reader need? Would it be approachable for a master's level student, or is it PhD and above?
Thank you. Yeah, it's at the same time, I mean, I aim to use as little jargon as possible and to explain things as easily as possible and in a clear language. Really paid a lot of effort to get that right, I hope. So from that perspective, I think it should be good for master students as well. Sometimes master students, I mean, depending, I mean, if they have a clear idea where they want to go, what they want to do in the master thesis, then it might be the right thing. If they're still in this orientation phase, then my experience has been QCA isn't the right thing, because you need to learn the method first and then also think about your master thesis. So probably more for PhD students or some advanced master students, I would say.
Thank you.
I will answer that question. I think it's an incredibly accessible book, and I'm looking at using it for undergrad class. Like it's really well written. I really like it a lot.
Yeah, that was the great
Thank you, Claude.
comment by Claude. Thanks. Other questions or remarks from the participants, both on site and online?
I mean, if you have questions, you can always send me a message or an email, right?
Yeah, Conan.
So, looks like in the last chapter you talked about R with the book. So do you have R package with the book, or it's just some advices on how to use R? And also you talked about online materials that is there. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. I don't have an R package. So, I mean, the packages that I refer to are Adrian Dusa's QCA package and Nena Oana, Carsten Schneider's set methods package. So, and the aim of the book is not to provide a sophisticated introduction to what you can do with the packages. I mean, that's been done, and we just learn about the next book in a moment. But what I realize is that the people that I teach QCA to, they often struggle to implement this. And very basic issues arise. And therefore I realized maybe we need some kind of a very basic introduction, very simple questions. I mean, starting with the installation of R, thinking about data structure, formatting your data, deleting a case, stuff like that, adding a condition. So very basic things in plain language. And that's what I try to provide in the R manual to get people started on using R if they want to do so. And the feedback that I've received so far in workshops has been very positive. People say, this is nice, this kind of gets me started. And then they can move ahead if they want to use advanced functions and learn about those.
Thank you for the question and for the answer. If there aren't other questions or comments, we thank Patrick for the presentation and of his book, and thanks also for the people that posed some questions. And I would say we go on with the next book presentation by Nena and Carsten.
Yes, Eva was supposed to be here with us, but unfortunately she had some medical issues. So I will start by sharing this slide, which she sent, so you can see Eva here, and start by saying that we are really very happy to present this book finally. It's been for quite a few years in the making, and I'm very happy to also see that many of you in the Zoom call actually have seen previous versions in one of our courses. So our book is called Qualitative Comparative Analysis using R, a beginner's guide. It's been published at Cambridge University Press. So if you just Google it, you can find ways to get it. And what I want to stress at the beginning is really this a beginner's guide part, because what we wanted to do with this book is really an easy to follow introduction to QCA with an applied and practical focus that would reduce the time and effort to learn a new method, but also to teach it. So it's designed both for those that want to learn it or as a teaching resource for QCA teachers. But beyond this easy and follow introduction, we want to couple this with offering basically the most complete protocol of QCA, including the latest state-of-the-art methodological innovations, which usually find their way through these 2 R packages that have been mentioned in this session. So the book is written with learning R in mind as well. And that's not just because we like it, but because it provides several advantages. So first, we really think this offers an analytic flexibility that it's hard to achieve with other software. So you can easily customize your analytic protocol with QCA. It has higher functionality in the sense that a lot of the state-of-the-art methodological innovation, which we will talk about in a minute, find their way through these 2 packages in QCA. And third, because of replicability purposes. And generally, we do believe that learning QCA with R helps you learn QCA better because of the transparency in the analytic steps that R provides, but also kind of makes learning R easier because of the easiness of applying QCA. In terms of who we want to cater this book for, as I said, it's both practitioners and teachers, and we designed it for all levels of instruction. So we really hope that this would be easy to follow enough for a bachelor student, but still interesting and complex enough for a PhD student and above. And with that being said, I'll give the word to Carsten, who will tell you more about the structure of the book and what it contains exactly.
Yes, also from me, thank you for presenting and also listening to Patrick's exposition of his book, which, of course, there's some overlap. We talk about the same method, but I think it's pretty much complementary. As you will see, we start later in the process of writing your QCA study and probably go a little bit more in detail on some aspects at least. And before I walk us through the structure of the book, and when then Eva afterwards takes over again and talks about the resources, online appendices and so on, I shall also say that when we talk to the publishers about the title of the book, they sort of arm twisted us in saying that must have the word beginner. I think we wanted to call it gentle introduction or something. But what I think is that you are a beginner when you start reading the book, but you're definitely not a beginner anymore once you have finished the book. So it's a little bit sort of ambiguous that we say beginner, because the third part, as I show you, is probably the latest stuff that is being dealt with. That's one thing I wanted to say before we go into detail. The history of this book is, as Nena already alluded to, and several in the room can attest to this, years of teaching QCA workshops and great questions you get from participants and the things you sort of struggle with then. They have materialized in this book, but it was a stepwise project. In a sense, it usually first materialized in adding new functions to the set methods package, or sometimes even with Adrian's collaboration then in the QCA package. So things that we thought should be possible, then we were made possible in R. And then we wanted to condense this in these 200 or so page long book. So this tightly knit connection between what we write in a book what is in the package is, I think, an advantage for those who want to apply the method. The book is part of a series of Cambridge University Press. It's called Social Science Inquiries, or Methods for Social Inquiry.
Methods for Social Inquiry.
Yes, and that is important to keep an eye on that series. It's recent. And the goal of the series is to mimic what SAGE has for quantitative methods. They have this green book series, very thin books on how to run regression, how to this and that. And so this is the qualitative equivalent. At least that's the goal, is this series in which our book comes out. It's not as thin as these Cambridge books, but the SAGE books, but I hope very readable. Now, if I share my screen and display here the structure of the book, there is some less standard things than others, but so it's the big structure of the book, that we have three parts. Part one is prior to the analytic moment. Part two is during the analytic moment, and part three is after the analytic moment. So the analytic moment we define as the situation when you have your data calibrated in a rectangular data set, and you want to look for subset relations or set relations of either necessity and or sufficiency. So that's the analytic moment. Before you get there, you have to do, as you see here in part two, well, actually it's part one in the structure more, is you need to calibrate sets, and you want to probably also combine different sets using logical operators. We show how this works with a direct method of calibration and indirect method of calibration. We pay quite some attention to analyzing or diagnosing the sets that you have created, whether they are skewed. So when you have a very big set, what this means for your analysis. When it's very small, what you can do and should do against it. Then in the second part, during the analytic moment, we have two chapters. One is on necessity and the other on sufficiency. We really start from the basics. What does it mean that you claim X is necessary for Y? How do you see this in your data? What are these parameter of fits? And then, of course, how do you do all this in R? How do you visualize set relations, in this case, necessity? Then probably, I cut it off, but you see the sufficient condition analysis. We go through through this step by step. We start with single conditions. What is X when it's sufficient? It's a subset. And how does it look like in crisp sets, in fuzzy sets? and then introduce the truth table and its analysis. How do you construct a truth table? How do you logically minimize it? And then also, how do you avoid pitfalls like simultaneous subset relations, untenable assumptions? So we introduced the standard analysis, the enhanced standard analysis. We also say a couple of words on model ambiguity and how this is reported in R and what to do in face of model ambiguity. Now, the one up until this point, I think a lot is already said in other books, and I'm totally with Patrick, who says you should not think that our books are newer, so you can forego reading these classics from before. I think this would be wrong. We try in part 1 and part 2 to make it very accessible for beginners, to also explore a little bit things that didn't really exist in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, and to show how this all works in the R environment. So you should read them, classics and these new books together. What we do in part 3, which is part 4 here, after the analytic moment, is we introduce stuff that really did not exist in that form several years ago, some years ago, I would say only. And this is things that we don't consider as extras that you might or might not want to do, which you only want to do if you want to show off. We think this should become standards of good practice, things that you want and should do, and you now can. And we explain these. So chapter 5 is rounding up a solid QCA, where you essentially want to say how robust or how much dependent on decisions of the analytics setup is your result. So we have a robustness test protocol, where Nena and I also just published an article where you get the extended version of it. We also discuss cluster diagnostic, which has been around for some time. We make it a more general sort of diagnostic of your QCA results, which not only looks whether when you have panel data, there are time trends in your data, but it can be any clustering in your data that you have overlooked, and you shouldn't. Say you have countries from all world regions and your results apply to all except for Africa. Then you should know about this, and this is cluster diagnostics. We have an oldie but goldie also the integration of time and temporality, where we don't make a new proposal, but we also summarize what is out there in the market. And we conclude that at the cross-case level, so where QCA is placed, the integration of time has, I think, intrinsic limitations. You will not and never be able to fully capture the analytic relevance of time in a cross-case analysis. You can do TQCA, CNA, two-step QCA, and this gets you somewhere, but not so as far as I think we need to. So we therefore have also in chapter 6 post-QCA tools, and I want to talk briefly only about first these set theoretic multi-method research, which is the combination of QCA at the cross-case level with within-case analysis at the within-case level. And I think that's sort of the point we make, and I say something in a second about a second book that is coming out. It is at this level where you can integrate time and temporality at the within case level when you do things like process tracing or other techniques to show how sequences of events are unfolded. And the second aspect of set theoretic multi-method research is coming back to a point that Patrick already raised, causality in set methods. The point I would want to make is that in order to make causal claims, you need to have both cross-case evidence, which is provided by QCA, but also within-case analysis on the causal mechanism, for which you would need or want to use the set theoretic multi-method research a framework, but that is something we can maybe discuss now after the presentation. Another post-QCA tool is a formal set theory evaluation. That's actually an idea that already exists in Reagan's, so the Old Testament from '87. It's only 1.5 pages, and in the 2012 book with Claude Wagemann, we talked about it. Here we have the R tools for implementing theory evaluation. And then in the final chapter, summary and outlook, we go through the analytic protocol as we have outlined it throughout the book. So the things you need to do at which stage of your research, prior to the analytic moment, during and after, what to look for, what are the challenges, and how to overcome them. Then we also talk about the diverse use of QCA. I mean, you can use it, I think, still for causal inference. It's difficult, but manageable. For descriptive purposes, you can be X-oriented, Y-oriented, and we outline the different forms of QCA that all need to follow quality criteria. So it's not that everything goes. We want to point that out. And then we conclude with recommendations of good practice and outlook. What will be the next steps on this journey?
Okay, so now that we've seen what the book contains, perhaps to end in a less abstract note and go back to the easy to follow structure of the book, I wanted just to point your attention to some of the special features and additional resources that the book contains, and how we try to basically distill all this amount of information into a really applied resource. And I will start sharing my screen again. And the first tool within the book that we designed several types of boxes that help guide you through the chapters. And I think after a first, let's say, in-depth read of the book, when you go back to the book and pick it up a second time, you can basically just look at these boxes, I think, and remind yourself about what each chapter contains. We have learning goals for each section. Each chapter is based on examples. Some are from published research, some are mock examples. So since each chapter is applied on one example, you can more easily follow on how the protocol is being applied. Again, each section of each chapter contains core points, which are basically the take-home messages that you need to basically have for that part. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we also have this good practice boxes, again, for each chapter, which draw your attention to pitfalls that you might have made and recommendations in terms of language, visualization, and so on and so forth. So this is within the book. Also within the book, in terms of application with R, actually we put the R part here, you can see within the book. So within each chapter, after a theoretical discussion of that specific protocol, we actually include snippets of the code that you need to apply together with its output, and try to explain it in as lay language as possible. So you get both of the implementation part and the conceptual methodological part at the same time. And we try to make the two reinforce each other. Beyond these resources that you can find in the book itself, we also designed several online resources that come as complementary. And first of all, we have an intro to R chapter. As we said, we want this book to be accessible for beginners in both QCA and R. So it can be picked up by people who have never seen R before or QCA before. So for that, we designed an intro to R chapter, which is designed specifically for QCA, which you can find online. And that's, I think, freely available. And as I said, this is designed for readers who have no experience with R. So it has detailed instructions from how to install it to how to get started to load your data in and manage this data, including the code for you to practice. So you can get started with this Intro to R chapter and then move on smoothly to the book. Beyond this, for all the codes, these snippets of codes that you can find in the book, you will have replication scripts. So you can practice actually the mock examples or the published research examples that we talk about in the book. So you can download these replication scripts and actually work with the data yourself. Beyond that, to again facilitate the R implementation for your own data, we have template R codes, which are basically customizable templates of the main R functions that are used before, during, and after the analytic moment. So this can be easily copy-pasted, let's say, into your R scripts, and you can just replace stuff with your own material. And finally, we also provide some further exercises and quizzes, so you can test your knowledge after having followed the book. And these exercises and quizzes also contain new data that we haven't used in the book, so you can practice on other kinds of data sets. And the quizzes are mostly conceptual quizzes. So we hope this whole diverse body of additional resources basically tries to water down the complex stuff that we talk about in terms of content and make it really accessible for you. I don't know if Carsten, you have any last words?
Yeah, one thing that really struck me over the years is that very counterintuitively, the fact that we expose beginners to both a new method and a new software is actually helpful. So our teaching students how to implement the ideas they have that they learned conceptually in the morning, then in the afternoon implemented in R, is a tactical tool. You have to think really carefully what you want to do. And my understanding or my impression is really you learn it better and not necessarily much faster. At the beginning, it's a little bit steep, but once you have reached a certain level, it really is very advantageous. So that I wanted to just say, not to deter anybody from thinking that you first need to learn the method and then how to do it. I think they can and almost should go together.
Yes, thank you to both Nena and Carsten and also Eva. Are there some questions from the audience? I've seen that somebody posted questions on the chat and also got the reply right away, so thanks. But are there questions from the participants on site and online? Questions or comments? Yes, Federico.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I just noticed that my son's Christmas work is at the back in my back. So I don't know. I'm just sitting here, and I hope you like it. This is like his Christmas decorations. So we've been talking a little bit about causality, and I noticed that Christian and I were already talked a little bit about set-theoretic method, multi-methods research, but we haven't been talking a little bit about inferences. So do you guys think that we should use Raging's approach to infer these causal relations based on abduction, or shall we think in a different way, using a different logic of inference? And if it's a different logic of inference, what is it? Thank you.
So the way I think that's in the book, I think partially too, is I would distinguish between causal inference and descriptive inference. And I think QCA can achieve both. Causal inference is infinitely more difficult. And as I indicated, I think you cannot just use QCA for drawing causal inference. or very weakly or indeterminate causal inference only, with many loopholes, I would say. But it's also totally fine to use it as descriptive inference, and I am fully with Patrick. Then we should be clear about it, that what our goal is, that we want to describe. And this ties into which solution formula should use. Almost by definition, the conservative solution is sort of describing more detailed, and so is, if you will, to be preferred, and so on. Now, the question of whether or not you should have hypotheses or not prior to a QCA, this is probably also a longer discussion. Of course, you should have hunches about what you think is going on, and you might even formulate them in Boolean expressions, but you certainly don't test those with your QCA, for the simple fact that in a truth table, you just look at all possible combinations of conditions and whether or not they are sufficient. You're not just testing one combination, your hypothesis. So of course, there's theory all the way through, prior, during, and after the analytic moment. But I don't know if you mean this with deduction and induction. So yeah, that would be my point about causal inference, just to repeat it. And can I put in the chat another book that I think is helping, will help a lot? If it's about 1,000 pages long, it is an incredible attempt to put set theoretic methods onto a philosophical footing, arguing strongly for regularity theory of causation being the underlying theory, but not the version that we usually think is. So it basically says, for causal inference, and we had it yesterday in our panel, you not only need a constant conjunction, but also spatiotemporal connection, meaning you have to have a causal mechanism. So that is why I'm so eager to saying that QCA combined with case studies is the best way forward, in my mind, for set theoretic methods people to get at causality.
Yeah, thank you for the question and the reply. Are there further comments on this topic or more in general on the book that Carsten and Nena just presented? I guess that everybody is very thrilled about both books and can't wait to look at them and work with them. I tend to think. Okay, I don't see other questions coming up from the audience, so I would say we thank both all three presenters of their books and also Johannes that introduced the classics at the beginning of this session. I would now give the word back again to Nena for the software update or the software session. So we just go on to the second part of this session on software.
Okay, so this I think will tie in nicely with the previous discussion of the book. So now I'll present the set methods package, which contains much of the tools that we deal with in this part 3 after the analytic moment in our book. I will share my screen again. I'll try to make this not very alienating for those of you that do not know R. So just walk you through the tools that the set methods contains. And let's say one of the first set of tools that we try to develop with this is visualization tools. And you can find different ways of producing enhanced XY plots for various stages of the analysis. So for necessity, then for sufficiency, for your different kinds of solutions. And we also with these enhanced XY plots, we also try to make this available now for crisp sets, so kind of enhanced 2x2 tables. And then there are other visualization tools such as radar charts. I'll just scroll down to show you how these look. These are the kind of sufficiency, let's say, plots that you can get for your solution. You can also get this kind of plots for crisp set data, so you can see how many cases exactly you have in each cell, and it provides easier identification of deviant cases. And finally, you can get this kind of radar charts to visualize your Boolean formula. So in terms of visualizations, these are some of the tools that SetMethods contains. The second set of functions that the package contain are robustness tools. And basically, it contains this protocol that Carsten talked about that we recently published in Sociological Methods and Research, and that we also talk about in the book, that allows you to assess how changes in your analytic choices affect your QCA solution. And that contains several tools. You can assess the sensitivity of your QCA solution to these changes, but we also talk about several robustness fit parameters that try to give you a measure of how robust your solution is, and also about identifying robustness relevant types of cases. So we talk about robust cases, but also about shaky cases that perhaps are not on stable ground if you change some analytic choices, but also about new possible cases that perhaps if you make a different analytic choice would become typical cases. And I'm gonna scroll down again to show you a bit of how this protocol looks like. So you see, you can get, for example, for the raw consistency threshold for truth tables, you would run it for those that know are just like a regular truth table. And the result you would get, it's down here. And it tells you basically that anywhere you would place your raw consistency threshold between, let's say, 0.73 and 0.8, your solution will not change. So it gives you a range of sensitivity for your solution remaining stable for different analytic choices, for the raw consistency threshold, for the frequency threshold, but also for calibration anchors. Here you can basically plot robustness types of cases. You can get like this robustness parameters of fit, which have various interpretations on which aspect of robustness is more problematic for your solution, but also types of cases. So which of your typical cases are robust, which of your deviant cases are robust, but also which of them are shaky, and so on and so forth. And you get types of cases. The third set of tools that SetMethod includes, it's this set theoretic multi-method research tools that, again, Carsten was talking about. And this basically, it's catered towards the identification of specific types of cases post-QCA, but also for comparative case studies. So it also allows you to identify best matching pairs of cases, depending on your analytic goals. So basically that again, I will go down here. That again starts with your, let's say, sufficient solution. It can be any solution type. And there's a function that allows you to identify basically all the typical cases, but also gives you measures on which one is the best available typical case. It tells you whether this is a uniquely covered case, whether it's the most typical, whether its values on all set membership values on all things included in the analysis, and so on and so forth. And this is done for all types of cases, and it can be a guiding tool in you selecting into which cases to do your case studies post QCA. And another set of tools is a set theoretic theory evaluation. This allows you to basically compare theories formulated in Boolean terms with your results of sufficiency. I want to show you how this works. Finally, we also have this cluster diagnostics tools, which allows you to basically assess whether cluster structures in your data are problematic for your solution. In other words, whether your solution holds equally for all clusters in your data. And this I want to show you here, because now for those of you that use the old versions, now we also designed visual tools for this. So you see here we have some data with a temporal structure. Here you would this would be the average consistency across all clusters. You could see clearly if one of the clusters really departs from your pattern of the solution. And perhaps that would be an indication that pooling all the clusters together in a single QCA, it's not a good idea, and perhaps you want to run a separate analysis or exclude that from your QCA. So this provides you with an easy tool to spot that issue and basically diagnose this assumption of pooling the data together. And finally, there's a host of other smaller functions such as skewness diagnostics and identification of ambiguous cases, a function for performing ESA, and some others which you can find by looking at the help package for said methods. So if you look, I can send you a link with where you can download the package. The package also comes with a PDF help guide in which you basically have the description of all of these functions, and you can see there in more detail how to apply them, what they do, and also other functions that I didn't mention in this presentation. So as you can see, most of the set method score is catered towards this after the analytic moment part, basically rounding up a solid QCA, but also post QCA tools such as set theory evaluation and set theoretic multi-method research. But it also has some tools that you use at various steps before and during the analytic moment, such as diagnostics tools of skewness and visualization tools. Yes, so this would be set methods. I think it's Adrian now, or
no, we will Claude and Roel later on, but if Adrian wants to say something.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say that when Adrian's part will come and talk about the QCA package, the QCA package is your go-to tool if you want to work in R for the during the analytic moment part. So we will hear about that in a bit.
Okay, thank you, Nena, for your presentation. We have a couple of more minutes for questions or doubts and remarks on the set methods package and the new tools. Or I don't know if Adrian wants to say something, but because he's not scheduled in the.
I just wanted to say that the QC it's not working.
Okay.
Yes, if you can.
Do you still
Just come close to the.
No.
I think if you sit next to the microphone, then.
Yeah. The QCA package and the set methods package nicely complement.
Can you hear Adrian?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you should be able to.
So, well, just speak up a bit.
Yeah. So just wanted to say briefly that the QCA package and the set methods package, they nicely complement each other. There are features that are specific to the QCA package that are used by set methods, and then there are functions in the package set methods that go beyond, as Nena said, the analytic moment. And I am so happy that these people work and extend and make add-on packages to mine. And I'm always happy and eager to assist anyone working with these packages. And we've been having a very, very good collaborative relation over the years, and we will continue to do so for the benefit of the users. So I'm quite happy to to see this kind of sparking work around the R packages, and I see a very good future with it. And I just wanted to add that I am working on a graphical user interface for the QCA package in R. It's still a bit of work to get it done, but I think in a couple of years, I think we will have something resembling the FSQCA software, but using R behind. So this is my goal. This is what I'm heading, and then we will look for opportunities to have an easy way to add menus and dialogues for the add-on packages to make a comprehensive software system for all of the packages in this universe. So this is a goal.
Yeah.
I see a good future.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot, Adrian. I'm looking a bit at the time, but we have 2 questions. If we can manage, yeah, relatively briefly, because I don't know how much time Claude and Roel we need. The time that is allowed, or the time that we can. Okay, so let's go for the first question by Jan Tao.
Yeah, I'm here. And I have 2 questions. That the first one is, when we use the set method package, we use large N sample, that is a large number sample. When we deal with large number sample, the set method package sometimes calculated the number very slowly, or even sometimes it has returned no response. How to deal with this problem, and there any hint can let me know whether there are any problem here. And the second question is how we set the value of the include cut. That is, when we use the 0.8, we can generate some configurations. And sometimes when we use 0.9, we could not get any configurations. So I adjusted the number to 0.8, that we can get some configurations. And could you please tell me how we judge this, and how we deal with the set of the value, include cut value? Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, I can also collect yours. So
yes, okay. I get mine is a bit briefer. Yeah, thanks Nena, Carsten, and Eva, who's not here, but thanks for talking about the new opportunities and possibilities with the set methods package. I think this is all quite exciting. I have a question about the robustness tests, and I think this is very useful with what you developed there with the thresholds that we can now test very easily with the set methods package. And just your reflection on that, how do you see that? Is this the new standard that you would like to see in peer-reviewed publications? What do you do with people who run a calibration and don't use this and just say they did some other kind of robustness tests or so? How would you position that? How do you estimate it? What should people do with it if they see, basically, if they chose other anchors, they would have gotten different results? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the very good questions. I'll try to be very brief. So in terms of large N and very slowly, some functions I think are more are faster than others, depending on what they do in the background. And I think our biggest problem in terms of speed is these SMMR functions, because they really calculate many values, and they need to compare all cases with each other in the data set in order to find the best available. So those are indeed quite slow, and we hope in the future to improve on this aspect. In terms of the value of the include cut, actually that's related to the QCA package, because it's the QCA package that contains the minimize function. So what happens a lot of times if you raise your consistency threshold, it could be that you have no configurations that have such a high consistency threshold. So of course, I guess the package tells you I have no configurations to minimize. You just told me that nothing is sufficient. So that's why I think this happens. So I hope this was helpful. Going to Patrick's question in terms of robustness, when we started working on this paper, this was our aim, to make a robustness test basically a standard tool. Now, it's not necessarily ours or other, because we think that our protocol covers a lot of it. You can do this one, but or others, but some form of robustness test should be there. To facilitate this, so our aim was to facilitate this. We also include in our wider paper, the one in sociological methods in research, we also include a robustness test report table. So you can run all these tests and have a template table for which to report your robustness results. So basically that makes it easy for people who do QCA to just report that table easily in their appendix, which people will understand what it means when this becomes more standard. That being said, sensitivity ranges are not the only part of our robustness test, because we don't consider whether a solution is insensitive to these changes. It doesn't mean that that solution is unrobust in other ways. So you could have very sensitive thresholds that change your Boolean formula, make it a bit different, but changing those thresholds might create solutions that are still in a subset relation with each other, which we consider the deviation for robustness not as bad as when you create two solutions that overlap to a very little extent and are not in a subset relation to each other. So that's why beyond sensitivity, which is one aspect of robustness, and you could be more or less sensitive with your solution, we really think it's important to also check how much overlap between any newly created solution you have, and whether these new solutions are in a subset with each other. And we really think our protocol with its implementation is the first one to bring this newer aspect of robustness to the fore, beyond just testing sensitivity.
Thank you, Nena, for your detailed answers. There is the last question I would say on the chat that maybe Adrian want to reply to about
just briefly.
Stata.
Just briefly, remember that QCA is a qualitative analysis, and what this means is that the researchers need to be very intimate. The researcher needs to have a very intimate knowledge of each of the cases included in the analysis, and that's why I think that, well, although the algorithm does not have a problem including large N QCA, it's kind of improper to say that QCA is a large N, because I don't think a researcher can have an intimate knowledge about hundreds of cases. And then about the inclusion threshold, I always advise to follow the original work of Ragin, where the threshold is set to exact point where it makes a qualitative difference between the cases immediately above and immediately below the threshold. I mean, of course, it's very nice to have the robustness test and let the data tell you what the range of the robustness of the calibration methods is, but this is data-centric. Whereas I think the calibration threshold is a very qualitative operation, and it should be researcher specific, not data specific. It's very nice that the data tells us what the range is, but ultimately the researcher who has the responsibility to set the threshold based on the theory. So that's it.
Yes, thanks, Adrian, to highlight this very important point that I fully agree with. I have to, well, there is another question on the chat about what happens with Stata, because it was a question by Federico, but I would say maybe we go on to the next presentation, otherwise we run out of time, and maybe we can reply to the question on Stata on the chat or during the next session. So I would give the word to Claude and Roel, and I thank Carsten, Nena, and Adrian for, and also Eva, of course, in spirit for the presentations about the software. Yeah.
not really sure it's straight away, but. If I get up, is it gonna follow me, the camera? So I can walk
Sure.
around
I
a
think
little bit?
so, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to thank Adrian for that sort of nice introduction to what we're going to talk about here, which is calibration practices. So this is part of a project that Roel and I have been working on for a couple of years now, maybe a year and a half. And we're very concerned about how do you do calibration and how do you do calibration well in QCA. Charles Reagan talks about calibration. This is from Redesigning Social Inquiry. I think it's a very, very important quote to really think about here. He says, uncalibrated measures, however, are clearly inferior to calibrated measures. With an uncalibrated measure of temperature, for example, it's possible to know that one object has a higher temperature than another, or even that it has a higher temperature than average for a given set of objects, but still not know whether it is hot or cold. Calibration is the hardest part of QCA. And certainly in the papers that I was reviewing yesterday, people frequently ask, like, how do I calibrate? How do I calibrate well? And if you're struggling with calibration, you're not alone. It really is, I think, the most challenging part of QCA. And so this is what we're trying to work on. There are also relatively few extended discussions of how to calibrate well. The one that I like the best, Johannes presented earlier today, is Charles and Pierre's book, Intersectional Inequality. They go through very carefully how they calibrate their measures. And it's a very nice illustration of how to do this. So what I'm doing here today is not just talking about how to calibrate, but this is actually part of, I'm writing a chapter. We're writing a chapter for a multi-methods handbook. And so this is part that has essentially lesson plans on different methodological topics. And so what I proposed was to do one on how to teach calibration. And this is drawn from both our own experiences in teaching calibration in the classroom, but also in industry. And I want to present an overview of what we're doing here and get some feedback from you all. And so I really would like to hear, one, does this help you all to understand calibration better and how to do it well and what we're looking for when we talk about calibration? What works here, what doesn't? And who would this lesson plan sort of work for? Who do you think it might not work for? Especially since it's due in about a month. So I'm trying to finish it up right now. Okay, so the basic idea behind this lesson plan is that you're going to teach calibration. And there are a few different aspects of what I want to cover in it. So we start by talking about what is a condition, because we calibrate conditions. We have developed a new metaphor for explaining what a condition is and the calibration process. We refer to this as the jigsaw puzzle metaphor. And in the actual lesson plan, we do a little bit of discussion between latent variable measurement models and QCA. I'm not covering that here. And then we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of setting your semantic thresholds and considering differences between relevant and irrelevant variation. And then it sort of concludes with an exercise on how to practice calibration. Okay, so what is a condition? As you're aware, QCA, we talk about conditions rather than variables. Why is this? The basic reason, we argue, is that variables are nouns that measure magnitudes. Okay, they are straight metrics. So income measures how much a person earns. Conditions, however, are adjective phrases. They describe a specific quality, such as the condition of being rich that is different from just straight income. So an adjective phrase describes a set, the set of rich people. QCA analyzes sets and set relationships. QCA analyzes adjective phrases, that is conditions. Okay, this is a real key to sort of in your QCA thinking, to start thinking in terms of adjective phrases. Okay. Adjective phrases, they qualify a noun. So an individual is educated, or we say an educated individual. We can talk about profitable companies. We can talk about democratic countries. The nouns can be complex, and this can make things a little bit confusing sometimes. So we might talk about a sci-fi film, where film is the noun and sci-fi is the adjective. But we might also talk about a hard science fiction film, where sci-fi film is the noun and hard is the adjective. And we can also talk about a popular hard sci-fi film. There are very few of those. But their hard sci-fi film is the noun object, and popular is the adjective, the condition. The condition is measuring the degree to which the object, the noun, exhibits the quality, the adjective. And calibration is really challenging because you're operationalizing all these things: the object, the quality, and how the quality is expressed by the object. So you're doing a bunch of different things all at once when you're calibrating. And this is why it can be so challenging. Okay, so the jigsaw puzzle metaphor. We realize that when you are thinking about what is a condition, what you're joining is a concept and a measurement, okay? And that what you're looking for is a nice tight coupling, a tight fit between those two things. So you might have your condition of democratic country, right? Here, the quality, the adjective is democratic, the object, the noun is country. And you're doing two things simultaneously. You're asking ontological questions that are all about the concept, and you're also asking epistemological questions that are all about the measure. Right? And those are you're gonna have different questions when you're talking about the quality versus the object. So your ontological questions are questions like, what is a country? What does it mean for a country to be democratic? Your epistemological questions: how do we distinguish countries from non-countries? Because you don't want to include the non-countries in your data. How do we assess the degree to which a country is democratic? So you've got at least 4 questions that you're asking when you're trying to calibrate your conditions. So what is calibration? It is an iterative process where you're trying to fit your measures and your concepts together. And they don't generally fit at the beginning. And this is why it's iterative. You have to reshape them. I kind of, with this jigsaw puzzle metaphor, right? So in this image, I skewed the shapes of the jigsaw puzzle pieces to show that they don't fit immediately. You're going to have to get some scissors out and reshape them a little bit so that they can work together. Okay, and so there's this back and forth as you're trying to figure out what the heck are your conditions. All right, so calibration. It is the process of revising and refining the measure and or the concept, right? The measure or the concept or both to achieve a tight coupling between the two. Okay, and it almost always involves going back and forth, back and forth. We refer to this process of achieving this coupling as a semantic mapping. Okay. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, but to show sort of different types of calibration processes. You can have one measure that produces multiple concepts. So you can use annual income and couple it with the concepts of a well-off person, a rich person, a not rich person, a poor person. That's fine. That's fine. One measure, multiple concepts. You can have one concept that's composed of multiple measures. So this comes from Merkel and Wright, his work on what is the middle class from a Marxist perspective. And he argues that a working class employee is defined by someone who has limited occupational expertise and limited organizational authority. You have to have those two measures, and they all have to be tightly linked together. Charles Reagan talks about macro conditions. Many people don't use macro conditions very much. We've expanded the concept of macro condition a bit. The way that Reagan talks about it, macro conditions are always joined by Boolean operations. We think that that does not need to be the case. This is an example from a project that I'm working on with another co-author, where we are trying to measure the prairie style home. So early 20th century, mostly associated with Frank Lloyd Wright. And what we have is a very complex measurement where we have 4 basic conditions that define the degree to which a home is prairie style or not. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but they are planar representation, integrated sites, sheltering projections, natural aesthetic. Each of these concepts are composed of their own sub-concepts, right? So they're all multidimensional concepts. And so planar representation has 4 sub-concepts that all need to be calibrated themselves. Sheltering projections has 2 sub-concepts, and then all of that needs to be tightly coupled and joined so that they all work together. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, I apologize. So what are some of the processes that you have to engage in when you are defining your semantic thresholds? How do you map your concepts to your measures and vice versa? There are 3 semantic thresholds that are common to all conditions. And so you always have to think about these. Your full membership, right? Your 1.0, we call that the ideal typical case in a Weberian sense. You have your 0, full non-membership. We call this a negative case, okay? You have your crossover point, right? Which is your ambiguous case. One thing that's important to understand, this is in the note, is that even though people talk about the crossover point a lot, it's almost always implicit. Unless you're using the direct method of calibration, you don't explicitly define the crossover point. It's only with the direct method that you have to sort of nail down exactly that number. But for most calibration practices, it's just implicitly part of the calibration. Above and below 0.5, distinguish between cases, what we call typical cases that possess enough characteristics that they are recognizable as instances of the case, as examples of the case. Below 0.5, we call atypical cases. They possess some characteristics to some degree, but you wouldn't recognize it as an instance of the case. So you might say, oh, this house has some prairie characteristics, but it ain't prairie. Or you might say, oh, this house, it's not pure prairie, but it's got enough that I'd say, yeah, that's a prairie style home. This is what calibration is trying to let you do. This is what it accomplishes. Beyond these 3 semantic thresholds, 1, 0, and 0.5, we often include additional semantic thresholds. So I just give an example of 0, 0.25, 0.75, 1.0. Something to pay attention to is you want to be careful about over precision. So sometimes people will have very sort of highly nuanced calibrations, and that often makes me a little skeptical because can you really distinguish 0.25 from 0.3 or 0.35? Often I'm not sure about that. This also dovetails with the idea of irrelevant variation. So Charles Reagan talks about irrelevant variation sort of at the extremes, below 0 and above 1.0. We collapse those together. But Roel and I think that you also have irrelevant variation often within that range. So maybe that there's no meaningful difference between 0.1 and 0.2. And so you're going to collapse those together and decide on a limited number of calibration thresholds. Ultimately, successful calibration is going to answer two questions. What does each semantic threshold mean ontologically, meaningfully? And what are the epistemological rules that produce each membership score? Okay, this is an example. I'm working on my time here. This is an example of different calibration possibilities. So as I said before, this is sort of a visual of the previous slide. So you have your three semantic thresholds that are always there, your ideal, typical case, your ambiguous case, your negative case. And then you can have different numbers of semantic thresholds, okay? And you should choose whichever one is most appropriate for your project. There is often a tendency of, oh, continuous would be better because it's retaining all the information. Not all information is necessarily relevant, however. So you need to really know your domain and think about what is the proper way of calibrating this. And so, I use 3-valued fuzzy sets a lot. I use 4, 6 a lot. And I'll use continuous as well. Okay, so I said that this is a lesson plan. And so the plan sort of after assigning Patrick's book and having the students read about calibration, and then we talk about it in the class a little bit, then there is a group exercise. The basic idea is that we first, as a class, come together and propose a bunch of different possible conditions for calibration. Then I have the students break up into groups. They get to self-select into which groups they want to join, because you need to have some domain expertise when you're calibrating. So I don't want students going into a group where they don't know anything about the condition that they're trying to construct. So in their groups, they then work on creating the condition. In this order, they have to figure out what is the object that they are going to work with, what is the qualifier that they are going to try to measure, and then they're able to sort of say, okay, the condition is this adjective phrase, and fill in the blanks. I asked them to identify 3 possible measures of the adjective phrase. And this is to get them thinking about different possibilities, and then I help them choose one of them to calibrate. And then the calibration process works in this order. They first define fully in, then they have to define fully out, and at that point they have a crisp set. Then, if it makes sense, we work on partially in and partially out. And that converts the crisp set into a fuzzy set. Finally, I have them construct a calibration table that details semantic labels, calibration rules, and membership scores. This is something that came up in the roundtables yesterday. A lot of people don't include, and this happens in published QCA pieces as well. People don't necessarily include all of their calibration procedures. And that is something that I would very much like to see change. And so in your calibration table, you should have those 3 bits of information, the labels themselves, the rules, and the membership scores. And here is an example. I'm sorry that it's so detailed. This is an excerpt from the Prairie Style project. And it shows that there are, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but I have the conditions listed, and I use the full description, and then in the parentheses are the identifiers that I actually use in the analysis. I have the type of fuzzy set that is created listed, and it's fine to mix different types of fuzzy sets in the same analysis. People wonder about that sometimes. And then I have the specific rules that create the different values, the semantic thresholds, that explain exactly what are the rules for achieving a particular value. In something like the direct method, I explained that we're measuring the depth of the eaves and then what is fully in, crossover, fully out. In a 3-value or a 4-value scale, I give the statements that are the rules for getting a 1.0 or a 0.8 or a 0. Notice on the bottom, the last one, the plinth-like footing. I'm not going to explain exactly what that is. That's the platform upon which the home is built. That is a macro condition. Maybe I should have specified that under type of fuzzy set, but it is composed of the previous two, the physical projection of the footer and multiple finishes. And these are simply weighted because they're already calibrated. We take 0.75 of the first and 0.25 of the second and add them together and get a continuous measure out of that. And that's the type of thing that you should include in your papers, I would like to see. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you, Claude. I think, you made it in 20 minutes, perfect 20 minutes. So we have a couple of minutes for some questions or remarks on Claude's presentation, and also, of course, there is Roel in the audience. So I don't see questions, so I guess that the presentation was really clear.
Maybe can I ask or comment, Sophia?
Yes, Carsten.
Yeah. So Claude, I also agree totally with you that one often does not see that researchers don't pay much attention to the 0.5 qualitative anchor, which really compared to the other two qualitative anchors is the most decisive. This makes a qualitative difference. I sometimes even wonder how important is it, except for technical reasons in a direct method of calibration, to specify the 1 and 0 anchor in the analysis of QCA. It really doesn't make a difference if a case is 0.89 or 0.9, or is it 1, or is it close to 0 or exactly 0. So it's really the 0.5. And I would want to hear your opinion on that, I would say. And then the second point, in response to the question in the chat, also there is a form of skewedness with sets that is oftentimes overlooked, namely skewedness towards the middle. So if all of your cases, imagine the scenario, all of your cases have 0.5 membership in a set, that's absolutely useless. And if all of your conditions had all cases at 0.5, then you would find evidence for everything. Which is kind of, how shall I say, counterintuitive, that the most informative fuzzy set is actually a crisp set, which is counterintuitive because we introduce fuzzy sets to have more information. But in terms of, in several analytic steps in a QCA protocol, it really, you should shoot yourself in the foot if you locate many cases close to the 0.5 anchor.
So yeah, I think your points are very good. So one, as you're aware, both Roel and I, we really like crisp set analysis, and we really like sets with a limited number of semantic thresholds, because we are very skeptical that retaining all information is actually all that useful. So referring to your second point, about 0.5, so this is a discussion that Roel and I sort of have had a lot, and sort of gone back and forth about, like, well, is 1.0 the most important? Is 0.5 the most important? And where we're at least today, is that when you're thinking about calibration, you need to start with your 1.0 in order to figure out what is your ideal type. And that's really important to figure out what the heck are you talking about in the first place. And after sort of honing in on that, then you can work on your other semantic thresholds. My preference is always to go to 0. What is not your ideal type? Because I think that gives you extra information if you're going to do a fuzzy set. But yes, you also have this idea of, well, what really kind of matters is, are you above 0.5 or below 0.5? Are you in the set or out of the set? And so in that sense, yeah, this 0.5, even though it's implicit in most calibration processes, it is very, very important. And maybe Roel wants to say a little bit more about that, because we have talked about that and sort of argued about that a fair amount.
No, there's nothing much I want to add. I agree with Claude, and this is a difficult issue, but I agree that in most cases, the crossover point remains implicit. And I would argue 1 and 0 are actual cases, or at least possible cases. 0.5 is really a point, a crossover point. It does not necessarily, and preferably doesn't actually identify a particular case. So in that sense, it stays implicit most of the time. It's important to think of it, because I agree completely with Carsten that crisp set are really analytically the most informative, but you don't necessarily need to actually pinpoint it.
Good. I would. Yeah, be honest.
Yeah, just to make more a bit out of curiosity. So when you work at a technical school like this with a lot of engineers and natural scientists, calibration is nothing new to them. That's like, that's everything you do is you calibrate models, you calibrate scales, you calibrate everything. When you're in the social sciences, no one knows about calibration, and it seems weird, and it seems like you're doing something wrong. So if you try to explain this to an economist, that's a nightmare discussion. Now, but when you talk to engineers, calibration is simple and straightforward. And when you talk about calibration in QCA, it becomes this big, who type of Harry Potter style thing where it's all like heavy and difficult and drains your energy. And so, okay, my question, how much do you draw on the simple, straightforward, common sense approaches to calibration in natural sciences and engineering? Or does QCA, for whatever reason, need a new type of calibration that's epistemologically informed and philosophically screwed up or whatever?
Yeah, so I think this is also why this project has taken a lot longer than we thought. I think when Roel first proposed it, he was like, because we worked on this common errors in QCA document. It was a short little nice piece. And he was like, why don't we write something similar about calibration? Just a couple pages. And we were like, okay. And then I was like, this is a little more complicated. I think it needs to be a paper. And then I was like, maybe it needs to be a couple papers. I think part of the issue is that in the natural sciences, you're simply calibrating your measuring instruments. And that's, in some sense, you're looking at just, is it accurately measuring the magnitude, and you're focused on the measure. Whereas what we're doing here is, in QCA, is thinking about concepts. And so you have to figure out what the heck is this ontological concept? And then you have to couple it with a measure. And that makes it a different thing and makes it more complicated. So that would be my answer. Maybe Roel wants to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll add to that just briefly. In social science, all measurement is theory and value laden, and that's to a much lesser degree the case in the natural science. A meter is a meter, a pound is a pound. We have clear definitions of what that is. In social reality and social science, that is not the case, and that is why I like to think of this as always a two-step approach. What is a democratic country? What is a prairie-style home? That gives you a definition, an analytical or ontological definition. And then the next one is, How do we know a democratic country when we see one? How do we know a prairie style house when we see one? And then it becomes complicated because there's lots of different ways in which you can measure democracy, prairie house, and that's why it needs thinking. But the fundamental issue is all measurement in social science is theory and value laden. There's no neutral, objective, clear-cut measurements as you have to a much larger degree in the natural sciences.
Yeah, Carsten.
Yeah, so both Claude and Roel said it in nice words. I can just recommend again this book by James Mahoney, who says exactly that the difference between natural science and social science is that natural science works with natural kinds or natural concept that exists outside of the researcher's mind. They have an objective existence, whereas nothing of what we are interested in exists unless we define it. And we define it differently. So we both sort of argue about what is the definition of democracy and then about how we can measure it. And that makes it so difficult. But I find it, and this is what Johannes brought up, important to tell all those who pretend in the social science that they do hard science, that this is bogus. I mean, A, they do calibrate in natural science, and B, you shouldn't pretend that inflation or unemployment is an objective thing out there that exists without you having defined it. So this is why I find it so revolutionary, this book that by Mahoney, he says social science must be scientific constructivists. So that's this new, I think it's this term, where you are aware that you construct your concepts and the way to capture them numerically is through sets and their membership. And then you use formal logic to analyze the scores that you have produced, basically running QCA.
Okay, thank you for. I think it's a very good way to close this long morning session. I would say we meet at 20 past to make the break a little bit longer, as we are already a bit late. So we'll see each other in at 20 past for the last session of the workshop, and I thank all the presenters of this morning or this first morning session, and also the participants that came so many. So see you in a bit. Bye bye.